having me, and nice to meet you all too. I know you're just starting off, but I'm sure that as you go through these next days, you'll see how lucky you are to be here with George and Elizabeth and Thomas. They put together something really special, and I hope it's a great time for you too. So I'm pleased to be here on your first day. I am, I think, in some sense, a little bit of the odd man out in the lineup because I am a philosopher by training. Since George mentioned it, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I hadn't thought much about doing that, but my undergraduate background is in physics, actually, and I was drawn to that because my earliest memories are memories of thinking about the big questions. What does all this mean? How did it start? How did we get here? What's it about? How does it all work? And so I went the direction of physics, and then I got my PhD in philosophy, still interested in those sorts of questions, but coming at them perhaps in a slightly different way. And so you're going to have a lot of really smart, interesting people to talk to over the course of these next several days, and almost all of them will be from a background of science, public policy, something like that, not necessarily the humanities. So what I thought we could do together with our time is for me to try to make a case, as everything's starting out here, for why philosophy might have something to offer this discussion. Again, I was just talking to George before we started tonight, and we were talking about the state of higher education today, and I'm sure that all of you know this as well. We are being forced more and more to specialize. I'm sure that's the case in your particular professions, whether it's, you can't just be an engineer, you have to know one particular thing super, super well. In my own area, I do continental philosophy at DePaul University. We read the texts of Heidegger, Husserl, Nietzsche, people like that. And it's becoming the case that you can't just be good at philosophy, you certainly can't just be good at continental philosophy, you have to be that one person who knows the introduction to Heidegger's being and time better than anybody else. Very, very, very specific. And as we get more and more specific, my worry is that we're getting farther and farther away from ways in which we could convene on the truth. Come at the truth from a lot of different angles and come to some solutions that are maybe going to help us all out in the long run. It's hard to have a Renaissance person anymore. And there are lots of forces that are fighting against that. Modernity, capitalism, corporate America, all sorts of different things. But one of the great things about us being together here is that we have a little bit of time to talk about getting at the truth from different sorts of angles. And so what I'd like to do is to suggest to you some different things that philosophy might have to offer this discussion. And although it's going to be pretty theoretical, and we won't talk about very specific public policy or engineering sorts of things, I want to raise some more general questions about ethics, about metaphysics, ontology, the philosophy behind everything that hopefully is going to be coming for you in these next several days. I do want to suggest to you that it's a really, really important set of questions. And in fact, without this level of questioning, the rest of it is just a kind of busy work. We've got to be thinking about these sorts of questions. And we shouldn't be putting it off for somebody else to do that. Everybody's got to be thinking about these sorts of questions. So the stakes are high in this, and it's hard to see the stakes being high because it may not seem like your own livelihood, your job, your degree, or even saving the world are based on it. But I think they might be. And from the very beginning of Western philosophy, the stakes have been high. In Western philosophy, we chart our way back all the way 2.5 millennia ago to Socrates, his student Plato, his student Aristotle. And they put Socrates to death for asking these questions, for asking the questions that went against the authorities of his time. He would meet a judge, and he'd say, "Oh, so you know all about justice, you're a judge." "Yeah, of course I do." "Well, then tell me, so what is justice?" And they get in a big conversation, and before long it becomes pretty clear that the judge has no idea what justice really is. He just follows rules. You act like that for a long time, you make a lot of powerful enemies. You get a lot of young people around you, and you tell them, question everything. Anytime an authority tells you something, demand to know why that's the case yourself, not just to be told that. And eventually, they put you to death. They made Socrates drink the hemlock. So it may not seem like the stakes are super high for us now, And it may not seem like somebody's got a cup of hemlock with your name on it if you're not doing this sort of stuff. But I think in a very concrete sense, the stakes are that high. Because we're talking about how we're going to survive as a culture. We're talking about how we're going to survive as a world. And we're talking about what constitutes a good life for all of us individually as well. So with that in mind, I thought about this and I came up with 5 different questions that we might be able to think a little bit about. The automatic numbering seems to just number. The philosophy. Everything is just one question in the end. So we're going to talk a little bit about ethics, and I'll fill you in on the history of Western ethics. We'll talk about the problem of gradual change in global warming, talk a little bit about the nature of tools, how we think of energy, what energy is, and then finally this question of sustainability. So we'll begin with the history of ethical theory. And I wanted to take some time to do this because it may not be something that you know a ton of. Maybe you took an intro to philosophy class when you were an undergraduate. Maybe you remember a little bit about Mill and Kant and those sorts of folks. But it's good to have a refresher on this, particularly because these are the big names that are associated with history in the West, the history of ethics in the West. John Stuart Mill and his utilitarianism, Immanuel Kant and his deontology. And the reason that I think it's really important for us to take some time to do this is because pretty much everybody who's doing ethics these days falls in one of these 2 camps. So I've done a little bit of business ethics. Try to block that out of my mind, that era of my life. But for a longer period of time, I did medical ethics. So I made my living as a bioethicist for a while out in California. And everybody who's doing professional ethics these days, like 99% of them fit in one of these 2 camps. The majority of them are utilitarians, we're going to see why. And then a lot of other people are deontologists and they follow Kant. So in many ways, this is really important. It's a live theory. It's making a difference in everyday people's lives. I would go into a room in a hospital and make sometimes life or death decisions, having to think through these sorts of ethical things. And the reason I want to spend some time for us to get to know this tonight is because when it comes to questions of the environment, these theories are terrible. They're almost worthless. And they're the only ones that we really have as a culture to draw on. So it's important to know something about them. And if you ever read any environmental ethics or read anything about anybody who's arguing why we need to go green, why this particular route of sustainability is better than this other one ethically, they're probably trying to come from one of these viewpoints. And they're always going to struggle with it because it's super, super hard. So I'm going to start by talking about Mill. Go out of historical order, but both these guys are Enlightenment thinkers. And the important thing to know about ethical theory is that when we reach the Enlightenment, we come to a point where these thinkers are trying to find ethical norms that are universal, that go for everybody. So one of the biggest things that happened with the Enlightenment was not just that science took off and said, I'm going to give you descriptions of why the world is the way that it is that's not based on religion, not based on faith, but based on fact gathering, empiricism. Philosophy really did the same sort of thing. Up until this moment in history, usually ethics and morality had something to do with religion. And so you had major thinkers in the Enlightenment who said, why can't we treat ethics the same way we're treating anything else? And that is not let it be based on questions that cannot be founded empirically. Not let it be based on differences in culture. So both Mill and Kant, and a bunch of other people as well, said, I want to come up with an ethical argument for what's good, and I want to share that argument. And notice I'm using the word argument here. Share that argument with someone else. And if they follow all the steps of it, they should agree with me like they're following the steps in a geometry proof. You couldn't get to the end of the geometry proof and say, yeah, I see every single step, but I still don't believe that the internal angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees. Why? That's just not me. Doesn't make any sense, right? But you can do that with ethics. You can say, yeah, I see your viewpoint, but I disagree with you. Why? Well, that's just not me. That's not how I want to live. That's not my culture. That's not my God. That's not how I was brought up, etc. In order to overcome that, to find an argument that's ethically and morally sound that would go for everybody, all these Enlightenment thinkers said, what we need to do is to found it on one thing that we can all agree on. We're not going to agree on religion. They gave that up. Can we find anything that we could agree on that might be a foundation for ethics? And so Mill believed that he had. And he said, although we differ in many different ways, culturally, religiously, in terms of race, sex, gender, he even talked about those things. There's one thing that we all have in common. To be human is to want to be happy. That is every human's goal. We all define happiness differently. What makes you happy is not going to be the same thing that makes me happy. But this is something we can all agree on. We prefer happiness to sadness, pleasure to pain. And if you get at the end of your life and you say, I was miserable the whole time, you'll think you didn't lead a good life. We all want to be happy. If that's something we can all agree on, is that something that we can use to found a universal ethic? This is what's called a descriptive truth, not a normative truth. A normative truth is something that would say how you ought to be. A descriptive is one that says how you are. And so we begin with the descriptive claim. You are the sort of person that wants to be happy. We all are. Can we get something normative out of that? The first thing that comes to mind for Mill is, well, if we can all agree that we want to be happy, maybe what we could say is that the right thing to do is whatever makes you happy. Is that not something we could all agree on? If the goal of life is happiness, then the correct moral thing is the thing that makes me happy. And so he thought a long time about that. And he wrote a lot about this, about the difference between happiness in general and happiness that's individually defined. And he said, I think I can prove to you that it's not individual happiness that's the right way to go here. There is an ethical theory that's like that. It's called ethical egoism. It has a lot of proponents. People like Thomas Hobbes argued strongly for it. The correct moral thing to do is whatever increases your own happiness. Today it's a kind of libertarian philosophy as well. We each follow our own individual happiness and we'll all be okay in the long run. But Mill said, we have to think about this more deeply, because is it really your own individual happiness that you think is the goal of life? Or could you agree with me that happiness in general, in the world, is something that's worth increasing, regardless of who's experiencing it? Any theory that divides up the world into multiple camps and then says treat those people differently based on where they fall into those groups has the burden of proof on them to show that the distinction they're using to divide up the world is a morally significant distinction, argued Mill. So for instance, and to make this a very cartoony sort of example, if you have a theory that says, let's divide up the world into two camps, all the light-colored skinned people over here and the darker-colored skinned people over here. And then we're going to treat this group of people differently than this group of people. This group of people will give right, these we will deny. This group of people can own this group of people. If you want to do that, the burden of proof is on you to show that the distinction that you use to set this up is somehow a morally important distinction. So is there a difference between these two groups? As I said, it's kind of cartoony example, but I suppose we could agree there is a difference. If you just look, like everybody here is lighter colored than here, or we could even measure melatonin level or something, right, in the skin. Yes. Is it a morally significant difference? I don't see how you can argue that. And Mill didn't either. Mill said, do the people in this group feel happiness in such a way that it's completely different than the people in this group? So it makes it something good here, but not so important there. Do the people in this group have a central nervous system that's essentially different, such that when they feel pain, it's bad because it hurts, but when these people feel pain, it doesn't feel so bad, so therefore it's not such a terrible thing. Aren't we, in all these ethically important ways of achieving happiness, of going for pleasure instead of pain, of finding a flourishing life, aren't we the same? And if that's the case, then this is not a morally significant distinction. We could divide up the world into men and women as well. Is there a difference? Yes, maybe. You've got different plumbing, different reproductive parts, whatever. Is it a morally significant difference? do these people feel happiness or sadness in a way that's significantly somehow different than these people? Again, no. And so Mill said, if you think about what egoism is doing, this theory that the right thing to do is to pursue my own happiness, what it's doing is telling you, divide the world up into two groups. In the first group, there's me. And in the second group, there's everybody else. There's a tiny group. It's very exclusive. And this group, everybody who's in it, I'm going to care a lot about. Just so happens it's only me, but I'm going to pursue happiness and pleasure and not care. And he goes back to that same question. All right, is there a difference between the two groups? Yes. You are a unique snowflake. But is it a morally significant difference? Is your spinal cord built in a way that's different than everybody else's for your pleasure and pain receptors? Is your conception of happiness fundamentally different from somebody else? And he just kept saying, no, no, no. You are not different from anybody else when it comes to these fundamental ways of experiencing pleasure, pain, happiness, sadness, etc. Therefore, can't we agree that it's not this group that I should be promoting, but it's happiness that I should be promoting? Can't we agree that it's happiness in general instead of individual happiness that should be the ultimate goal of life? Now, Mill at this point thinks he's just using rational argumentation. If you're with him at this point in this step of the proof, it's just like a geometry proof, right? So he thinks he's got us all believing now that what we should do is to try to promote general happiness. But from there, we encounter other questions. What does it mean to promote general happiness? Well, if we want to have a happier world, we need to maximize it. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. We can create the greatest amount of happiness, and we can try to spread it over the greatest number of people. So, the intensity, and spreading it out over as many people as possible. Maximizing happiness in the world has those two elements to it. Again, simple logic, he argues. Now, when we think about whether an action is good, there are two ways of looking at that action. We can look at the consequences that follow it, or the intentions that come before it. And Mill says, how should we judge people's actions as morally good or bad? Should we look at their intentions? Did they mean to make people happy? Or their consequences? And it seemed to him again that it was just rational, that we should go with consequences. Because there had been too many ethical theories in the world that have said, if you just have a good heart, you're a good person, but you don't actually have to do anything or make anything better. And that's not what we want anymore, said Mill. We don't want a kind of religious ideology, as he called it, which said that if you just think good things, you're a good person, to sneak into ethics, because it actually doesn't necessarily make the world a better place. We're only going to say that an action is ethically good if, in fact, it maximized happiness in the world. We're going to judge you by the consequences of your actions. You put all this together, that we should be pursuing happiness in general because it's the ultimate goal of life, that we maximize the greatest number of people, greatest amount, and we judge it by the consequences, and you get the utilitarian ethical rule. The correct moral action is the one that leads to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. This is a rule, Mill said, that we can all agree on regardless of our culture and our background. It's just been through rational argumentation that I presented this to you. And it's a rule that will answer every single ethical question you ever encounter. If you want to know what's right, ask yourself, will this action lead to the consequence of the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people? If so, then it's a good thing to do. This is the basis of triage ethics. When you have a bunch of people that are hurt, and you want to help them all, but you can't help them all. So you put them in categories of who is most likely to be benefiting from the help that I can give. Yes?
Can you give an example that is a correct moral action?
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to do that. If you don't mind holding on for just a second, I've got a couple that I'll put up on the screen for you. I'll show this in action. But triage is actually a good one. So if you have some medical resources that you need to put to use and you have two people and one is likely not going to make it, the other one is, well then the correct moral action is the one to help the person who is. Why? Because you're just wasting resources on somebody who's probably not going to be that happy, not going to increase the happiness of the world in the end. Before I show you this in action, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the opposing viewpoint, Kant, and then we'll see them compared to each other. But before I do that, let me just tell you that although there are a lot of people that were convinced by this, and if you think about the time when this was, at this period of Enlightenment, it was actually a pretty exciting time when everyday people were talking about this sort of stuff. This wasn't just going on in schools. This wasn't just for philosophers. Mill was publishing pamphlets. They were being passed out on the street. People were talking about this in bars. They were debating utilitarian theory. This was something everybody was excited about. And it really swept up the entire culture. It had an influence. In fact, Mill's not the very first person to say this. If you look at his states theories in the 19th century, he was the person who sort of codified all these rules. But it was around in the 1700s as well. His godfather, Jeremy Bentham, had tried to argue this as well. And people like our so-called founding fathers, Jefferson, was really influenced by this theory. Think about democracy. Democracy is based on this idea. If you want to know what's right, ask the majority of people what they want, what would make them happy, and then do that. So it's an ethical theory that really made a difference in the world. It's really affected a lot of people. And in terms of applied ethics today, like in bioethics or a business ethic, I would say easily 75% of the professional ethicists out there are utilitarians. It's that popular of a theory. Having said that then, let me suggest, before we look at the alternative, that it's got some, I was going to say problems, but let's just say weaknesses that we might want to think about. Because it's not always clear that this leads to something that our gut tells us might be right. And I know that as a philosopher, I shouldn't say, well, my gut tells me, I should have arguments for it. But it can be an interesting check that might get us to think more critically about something. And if you think about utilitarianism, it sounds like it sort of matches your gut. Why not make more people happy than less people? But it does lead to some really weird things. So for instance, that third clause there, that maximizing happiness means the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. If you think about that, this theory might give the okay to slavery. How? Anybody got a thought? Yeah.
All those people working hard in the fields can provide for the larger population that is.
You got it. You got it. In a weird way, it's almost mathematical. You know, if you get 51% of the population really happy, enslaving 49%, you might have been a good utilitarian. Back in the early Christian era, when Rome had not converted yet, they used to, in the Colosseums, throw Christians to the lions. You probably heard this before, right? And everybody would come and watch that. Oh, that's terrible. And certainly utilitarianism would hate that. One person being very, very unhappy as he's being eaten alive by a lion. But utilitarianism says, well, maybe it's okay. Can you think of a circumstance under which it might be okay to do that for a utilitarian? Pardon?
The audience feel happy.
The audience. Now, I imagine that the audience, their happiness level of each individual person is not going to measure up to the unhappiness of the guy who's being eaten alive. But if you get enough people there, you might end up making it come out tipping in the side of more happiness than less happiness. And again, this is not an argument per se. It's just saying that this happy little theory that seems sort of straightforward and like, oh yeah, anybody could accept this, leads to some weird places. And the whole consequence thing leads to weird things too. If you have terrible consequences but end up creating good accidentally, you get called morally good by this theory because you made the world a better place. So it does lead to strange things. Yes?
I just had a quick question. It seems like this theory could never be stationary though. So if we had slavery, so 51%, right? So if the greatest number of people, we could have greater, knowing that only 51% out of 100 are happy, knowing that the greatest amount for the greatest number of people, we would say, well, 100% is the greatest amount of people that we can achieve. So wouldn't it create a society that's consistently creating good for the, but they have to acknowledge that there could be greater amount of people happy.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Mill thought about those sorts of things too. And he said that there are all of these possibilities, and some of them are not going to be realistic. That is, a society in which 100% of the people are as happy as they possibly can be is a goal that will only reach asymptotically. We can aim for it, but we might not get there. Which means that every single day in concrete cases, because he wanted this theory to actually solve real everyday cases, every single day in concrete cases, you've got to ask yourself, well, right now, compared to the most realistic other alternative, is this the better one? And so that's how you get this weird, maybe slavery is okay right now sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering why happiness is the only measure in this theory. Because, for example, if you can equate unhappiness as we are considering happiness in the equation, then you can kind of reach at an equilibrium where we say, okay, this is safe to implement.
Right. That sort of question, and the question, I mean, you use the term equilibrium there smartly. Notice that there is a kind of calculus to this involved, where you're measuring things and weighing things. And at a later point in Mill's life, he actually came up with something he called the utilitarian calculus. And he suggested that to solve some of the problems that we've even been talking a little bit about here, what we really need is a system of weighing actions and providing them some sort of quantitative measure that will tell us whether they're actually increasing happiness or increasing unhappiness and how those two things will meet. And he came up with this idea that he called udal points. You can assign udal points to different things, and then you can actually just do it like a math question. And it was completely insane. It made no sense at all. And you can see why he would want to go there, but it doesn't make any sense because all of these udal points things are just completely arbitrary. And I think actually what this does is it raises a deeper philosophical question about the very first point up here, about happiness. We could attack this a couple of ways. We could say, well, what is happiness? This thing that we supposedly all want. Because although we do define it in different ways, and Mill admits that, maybe we define it in ways that are radically different from each other. How do you compare the happiness of a little child to the happiness of your grandparents when you call them, to the happiness of a life partner that you have, to the happiness of a puppy? And by the way, puppies count for Mill. They can be happy or sad, experience pleasure or pain. He was one of the first major philosophers to say, we got to start paying attention to other forms of life other than humans. How do you compare those happinesses? Let alone, how do you assign udal points to different... It's a very bizarre thing. So that's one way we might be able to approach this question of how to measure happiness, or is it really the thing we're after? But we could even go bigger than that. We could say, are you sure that happiness is the goal of life? Is everyone really going to agree with that? What would you say to that? Is happiness the goal of your life? You certainly don't want to be unhappy, right? I don't imagine anybody here wants to be unhappy. I don't want to get into your personal life, but even if you're a sadomasochist or something, the reason you want that is because it makes you happy, right? So, of course, no one really wants to be unhappy. But is that the same thing as saying happiness is the goal of life? Does it matter how you're getting the happiness? Is that important to you? You're here at this workshop this summer because you care about a certain set of questions. Would it matter to you if you have nothing to say about this the rest of your life? You don't participate in this discussion anymore? You don't try to help out? But you just go someplace and, let's say, take drugs forever? Until you die let's say very happily with a heroin or I don't know. Going a place I didn't plan on going here, but, right? You know what I mean? You can be kind of mindlessly numb happy, but is that really what you would call fulfilling life? Even if you really were in pleasure, and really were happy by that. Yes?
So I don't know if you're asking rhetorical questions or if you're asking real questions. But I've decided
It's all one question.
yeah, but I did just want to point out, I think it's interesting that, and I guess this is also a clarification question about what Mill thought, but are we assuming that Mill thought that happiness equated to the purpose in your life? Because some people, especially depending on like what religious background you come from, or just any given, what's the word? Not principle, effect, influence, anything like that. You could actually spend your life doing something for which you think you have a purpose, but it doesn't necessarily make you as happy as doing something either less rigorous or less dangerous would. And so that's also something to think about, I think, because, for instance, like sustainability, when it first started, I'm sure that a lot of people working on it had a lot of discouragement from other people. But if it was their purpose, but then ultimately they might be happy by it. So I don't really know. I'm just wondering what
Right? No, it's very, very good. But the last little thing you said is exactly what Mill always does. He always says, yeah, but wouldn't that really make you happy in the long run? And even if you need to suffer for your religion or you're giving to other people, isn't that really what makes you feel fulfilled, feel like you're a good person? Even if you probably think you're going to get some reward from that. Religion's big on that. But even if you take reward out of the equation, isn't this still just you feeling like, oh yeah, this is what I should be doing. I feel fulfilled. I feel happy by it. That's what he would say.
Okay.
I don't know whether it's a fair thing to say, but that's what he would say, exactly.
What
Yes,
does he mean by like be happy? Like is being fulfilled, being happy? Like
I don't know. He doesn't say. And he thinks that's a strength of the theory, that we can all define it in different ways. I guess I would say that it's something for us to think about whether it's a strength or a weakness. Because basically all you can do is give synonyms for happiness. You can't really give a definition. And one of his favorite synonyms was fulfillment. If you lead a fulfilled life. Clearly happiness is not just pleasure, not just physical, right? But then if you say, well, what is fulfillment? That's hard too, because even sometimes when you reach a goal, don't you just want to have another goal then? It just sometimes it can be a letdown even when you get what you want. It's really, really hard. It seems like, I don't know, if we're going to suggest problems with Mill, or at least things that we need to think about if we're going to be utilitarians, one of the things to think about is happiness really the be-all, end-all of life? Who doesn't want to be happy, for sure? But might there be other things that are important? There's certainly good examples of artists. An artist might say, no, I want to create something. So, well, doesn't that make you happy? Well, maybe not. I feel like I've just got to do something and leave the world in a different way. Yeah, but you want to be happy with it. You want to get notoriety. Well, I realize I might not. But still, I think there's something worthwhile to this creative endeavor. Philosophers used to say that. They don't say it anymore because it's just a job these days. But philosophers used to say that. They used to say, well, I want to know what is the meaning of life. And we say, well, you want to know because that'll make you happy. And I can tell you as a philosopher, that's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of much better paying jobs. And it's also the case that I have to admit, I may not be smart enough to figure that out. So I may reach the end of my life and be miserable because I couldn't figure out what it's all about. Worse yet, I might figure it out, but the answer is actually super depressing. I have to admit it's possible, right? So why would you do that? Because the philosopher says, why would I do that? How could I not? Because if I don't ask the question, what is this about? Everything else is just a game. So we know that if you have two options, one in which you have a lot of pain and one in which you don't have a lot of pain, this theory gives you a good answer for that. And so very often his response was, I'm a pragmatist. I'm not some pie-in-the-sky philosopher. I want a theory that people will use in their everyday life that will change the world for the better. And this is one of those things when you actually have concrete cases in front of you that can help you. So I can't tell you for sure, well, you should do this and you should do that, well, when this particular thing happens to you. All I can do is tell you to act in a purely rational way. And there's really only one thing that rationality ever always demands. and that is that it's not self-contradictory. That's the simplest thing that I can say about logic. You cannot have both A and not A true at the same time. There are lots of other logical laws, and we might have to talk about them, but this at least we can all agree on. The law of non-contradiction founds all intellectual activity. Everything comes from it. So all I know about the categorical imperative is that whatever action I'm doing, at least if it actually is a universal action, like I'm really doing it and everyone's doing it, there's no logical contradiction. And that, in fact, is called the categorical imperative for Kant. Always act in such a way that your action could be universalized without a logical contradiction. Imagine that what you were doing were to become a generic law, even a law of nature, Kant called it, such that everyone were acting that way because we are compelled to. That's how things are. That's how everyone acts. Is it possible that could be? Or would there be a logical contradiction that would keep it from happening? As long as there's no logical contradiction, you are being a good moral person.
How does this differ from Thomas Hobbes' argument that we should be acting in our own self-interest? Because it seems to me that the only action that could be universalized without, the first thing that comes to mind is an action that can be universalized without logical contradiction is we should all act for our own self-preservation.
Yeah. So the problem with that is going to be Hobbes is a consequentialist. He's asking you to try to think what's going to lead to my happiness and then to choose X to get to Y. And Kant's going to say, don't ever think about Y. Just follow X if X is not logically contradictory. I'll give you a couple examples to show you how it ends up being different. So maybe being even more concrete here will help. So I came up with a couple examples here that are standard classical ethical examples, and then maybe we can talk about some more specific things. But should I steal food if my family's starving? So faced with this, this quandary, if we're trying to follow one of these Enlightenment thinkers, utilitarianism is going to give us one rule. It's going to say, well, choose the action that leads to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So if my family's starving and I think, should I steal a loaf of bread from the grocery? Should I walk into Dominic's or Vaughn's, or let's be more bourgeois about it, should I go to Whole Foods, right? Steal a loaf of bread, it's not going to hurt Whole Foods, right? They're going to be a little bit sad, but my family's going to eat tonight. So I'm maximizing happiness. It might get more complicated, but basically it's going to look like that, so the answer is probably it's the right thing to do. It seems like you're going to be maximizing happiness by doing it. Now, what about Kant? Here's where it's interesting. So Kant, the first thing he would say is, I don't want you to think at all about what this will lead to. Don't think about whether or not this is going to keep your family from starving, or if Whole Foods is going to go out of business because of petty theft. Don't think about anything. I want you to think about this action, and this action generically, not you and your family starving and bread, but stealing. Think of it as stealing. Could you do X? Could you say stealing is a universal law, such that the right thing to do always is for everyone to steal, and it's accepted. Everyone steals. Now, the first thing that might come to mind is you might say, oh, well, that would lead to chaos, or that would lead to sadness down the road. Again, Kant says, I don't care. Those are consequences. That's not what I'm looking for. I want to know, is it logically possible to imagine a society based on stealing? Logically. His answer is fascinating. He says, well, we got to think about this almost like it's a math problem. So you say, all right, I'm asking myself, should I steal this loaf of bread to feed my family? First, I get rid of all the specifics. I'm just thinking of it like a law of nature. Stealing. Could there be a law of nature called stealing? What if everyone were to steal all the time? What if stealing were the norm? Now, I don't care what would happen as a consequence of that. I want to know, is it even possible? So what is stealing? Stealing is taking someone else's private property without their permission. Let's just call that a definition of stealing. Pretty non-controversial. So taking someone else's private property without, what if everyone did that? What if that were the norm? You had a right to take anybody else's private property without their permission. All right, what's private property? Private property, by definition, is something that you and you alone have a right to. So if you think about it, if stealing were the norm and everyone had a right to take anything they wanted, there wouldn't be private property. And if there's no private property, how can you steal? It is logically incoherent to imagine this being a universal rule. That's how you know it's immoral. So the answer for Kant is no. Stealing is always wrong, period. Give you another example. Should I tell a little white lie to spare a friend's feelings? Not a big whopping lie to save the world, but just a little white lie. So my wife has a friend that comes over and she just went shopping and she's got a new dress on and she says, oh, what do you think? It's the most hideous thing I've seen in my life. What do I say to that? And I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm going to say, yeah, it looks great. Should I? For Mill, the answer is pretty clear. Yeah, probably. Probably is the best thing to do. Because what are you going to do? If you say the truth, how's that going to help anybody? Right? You're just going to make more sadness in the world. Don't do that. Don't do that. For Kant, complicated again, but a matter of pure logic for him. He says, I don't care about it being a little white lie. I don't care about being the dress. I get rid of all those things. I got to look at the act generically. Should I lie? Could it be universalized without a logical contradiction? What if everyone lied all the time? Whenever you were asked a question, the response everyone gave were a lie. And he thinks, well, what is a lie? A lie is when someone asks you something, they expect the truth, but you sneak something else in on them and you fool them. If it were universalized that every question was answered with a lie, there'd be no more expectation of the truth. You couldn't fool anybody. You couldn't really be lying to them. Universalizing lying makes lying impossible. It's self-contradictory. Therefore, it's immoral.
You said most people follow Mill's train of thought.
You can see why, right? It's a rough lie for me, Kant.
What?
A rough lie.
This is one that Mill says no.
Well, can you think of one?
Oh.
So it's harder to think of ones that Kant says yes to. But I'll give you one example. It's not up here, right? But I'll give you an example. What about jaywalking? So when things are over tonight at 8:30 and I got to go back to the parking garage, I'm thinking about just crossing Halstead instead of going to that little crosswalk thing. Should I do that?
Yes.
Maybe. Right? Maybe Mill might say, I don't know, I mean, it could lead to injury, you could get hit by a car, it might lead to suffering and pain. I think you have to do this calculus, it's hard to say. But Kant would say, is it okay? Well, let me ask, what if everyone were to jaywalk? All right. So what is jaywalking? Jaywalking is not crossing at an intersection. So every time someone wanted to cross the street, they just crossed in the middle of it. Would that make it impossible, therefore, to cross in the middle of streets? Not really. Okay. Go for it. And what that shows you is, and this is actually an important point, there's a difference between legality and morality. Kant says if you go into another society, you may not know the laws there, but you'll always know morality, because it's based purely on logic. So I could go into another society and cut across the street and they could say, hey, you're going to be fine, that's jaywalking. I say, I had no idea. But if I go into another society and I start stealing, I can't say, oh, I didn't know that you outlawed stealing here. Stealing is wrong logically, therefore it's wrong morally. Yes?
So Kant seems to be saying that we can apply the same logic to an individual action as we can to the same action on a universal level, and those things seem to be equated. That, to me, seems like in itself a logical fallacy. Is that something, I mean, how do you make that leap from saying that, well, if we want it to be universally applicable, but then the logic in evaluating that might be different from evaluating a certain specific moment?
Sure. Does anything come to mind where you see it would be different? Because my guess is that Kant would say, I'll never see it being different. Logic is logic. We don't always, but we are rational, says Kant. That's that first thing that was up there, right? So we all have access to it. And if you're not following logic, that might be immoral of you. You might be doing something ethically bad. Yeah? Yes, please. Sorry.
Well, I have two questions. So the first one is, does it both seem to be structuralist? Is that fair to say?
For sure. For sure. This is long before post-structuralism.
So essentially, but then they both seem to run into, so I guess their approach to paradoxes, what would you say, that's just my first question, like,
Yeah.
what, in terms of this, it seems as if people know, and I'm leaving no out because it seems better off. But essentially, like, he seems to be running into paradoxes, like, to be happy, you might essentially have to be unhappy to be happy.
Right.
So it essentially could be a paradox. For Kant, if it is a paradox, it is immoral, or is that?
You've got it. That's exactly right. So with Mill, for instance, the paradox that you're talking about, Mill actually wrote about. If it's necessary for someone to be a little unhappy in order to be happy, it's like if you're just super happy, you might forget how happy you are. So sometimes it's good to, have a little pain. He said it might be necessary to inject a little bit of sadness in some people's lives so they know how good they've got it when the sadness is not there. Super weird, right? That the ethical thing to do might be to hurt you a little bit so you feel good when I'm not hurting you. But he does talk about that and considers it not to be a paradox but just a reality. And with Kant, you're dead right. The paradox is the source of immorality. So you're looking for something that's non-paradoxical, and that's always ethical.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
isn't there like, it's not a paradox, but there's you use like math problems, like empirical.
Right.
Isn't there like a math problem, a series problem that is unsolvable?
Right.
3x plus 1.
So your question about are these structuralist means this is coming even before 20th century math comes along, math and logic, and suggests that some basic systems of logic, like basic arithmetic, is incomplete. That there are going to be things that are true that cannot be proven to be true within the system, like Gödel, right? So these sorts of people. That's a kind of logic that Kant's not dealing with, for sure. So one way to think of this, though, is to think of it on the level of a natural law. That's what Kant also said that people should do. Imagine that what you're doing were a natural law, like things falling down instead of going up. If it could be a natural law, then it's an okay thing to do. But if not, then it wouldn't be. And that's because no natural law is logically contradictory. In Kant's, in the cemetery where Kant is buried in Königsberg, Germany, on his tombstone it says, "The starry heavens above me, the moral law within me." And he believed that he was describing things that were essentially the same. Universal necessary truths based on pure logic.
So I don't know if this is Kantian or Millian.
Reloaded.
No, right.
We developed a question while you were.
Yes.
Remember how you said that Millian philosophy was used to drop nuclear bomb on Japan? What would Kant have said? What would his?
Very good. Kant has a really interesting essay called Perpetual Peace. So people in peace studies programs read Kant a lot, actually. It's one of the first people to argue for this, and the impossibility of war, the illogic of war, therefore the immorality. For him, a question of war comes down to just a question of killing. Because remember, he says, get away from the specifics of the situation. Because you'll always make an excuse for yourself. I'm stealing, but it's to save my family. No. Stealing. Is stealing right or wrong? So I'm killing somebody, but it's a just war because... No. You're killing someone. Can you kill someone? And for Kant, killing violates the categorical imperative. And it's a pure matter of logic. He says, what if we universalized killing? Universalizing killing means you're saying it's okay for anybody to kill anybody else. That's the norm, that's accepted, I want it. Which means that you're saying you can kill anyone and anyone can kill you. That's fine. Now what happens when you kill someone? What is a person? A person is a rational agent. A person with a will, it's choosing, a free will. So what you're doing is you're saying it's okay to take away someone's free will, to eradicate that from the world. And you're saying since it's okay to do it to anybody, you're saying it's okay to do it to you. In other words, you are freely willing that you no longer have a free will.
What about
Logical contradiction. Pardon?
What about eating meat? Killing animals?
So Kant is no friend of animals. it brings us to the next point even. Trees, oceans, planet, we can talk put animals in there. So for Mill, animals matter. And Mill actually wrote about ethical vegetarianism. Peter Singer is the modern utilitarian vegetarian. But when it comes to environment in general, for Kant, you have no duties to a puppy because that's not a rational agent. You certainly have no duties to a tree. So for Mill, the problem is that these sorts of things don't factor into utilitarianism because they can't be happy or sad, feel pleasure or pain.
But they can, it has been proved in scientific experiments that trees or plants do feel emotions.
Yeah. So I personally think that's some of the most fascinating stuff out there. I'm teaching a graduate seminar in philosophy this fall about plant beings. Philosophical questions about plants, and we're going to be reading some of that stuff together. And do plants have a kind of consciousness? Is it the case that they feel pain? For Kant, he certainly didn't have any access to anybody who was arguing things like that. So for him, it seems like a done deal. For the people who try to make it work today, and the reason I put up no, not really, because they're not rational agents, that's the traditional Kantian response. So even if you can feel pain or have a kind of consciousness, it's not important for Kant because all you have to care about is whether something is rational. Those are the only things that really matter in the long run. So even if it's the case that we could argue that there's consciousness and the ability to feel pain in certain plants, it wouldn't matter for Kant. Go ahead.
Well, the reason we are worrying about environment, planet, and trees, ocean is not for them.
Yes.
We are worrying about them for us.
Yes.
Because we couldn't live without them.
Which is precisely why, for utilitarians, we could say that there is some sense in which they become important. But they become important only in the sense of, do they increase happiness for human beings? Or for other things that can feed, right? So we can worry about, let's just call it the environment for short, but never about it per se or for its own sense, for its own sake. We can only use it as a utility. And the reason I say that this is a dangerous game and this is not really great for environmental ethics to begin with is you might say, well, we need to conserve the world. Pardon, why? Because future generations' happiness depend on it. All right, that's true. But you don't really care about the world. You only care about the world because it happens to be making people happy. If we find another world that looks better, then trash this one and move on. So, in any theory that inherently says this stuff doesn't matter, it only matters if people happen to be using it and needing it right now, there's a danger. And certainly with Kant, it doesn't matter pretty much at all. There are very few Kantians who are arguing about our need for sustainability or environmental ethics in general. And these are the two main ethical theories, and they both have a really hard time talking about any of the stuff that you've gathered here to talk about this summer. So I guess I'll close this first section. We took a long time in this section. We'll go very quickly through the next ones. But this is the most important because I wanted to show you both the normative foundation for our society, but also to show us that the tools that we have to work with to solve these problems are not super great. It's an ethical struggle just to be able to talk about why this is important. So we've got a lot of difficult work to be doing. Yes?
But do you think that, I mean, those gentlemen that has been a long time ago, and I think it was very uncommon at that point to see anything else that was not human to associate with having feelings. And if they would live today, would you feel like they would still argue the same way, or they would just argue that, for example, for the happiness case, that it's not just about humans, but that it's also about all kind of beings?
Yeah. It's a fair question, and it's always hard to answer those sort of counterfactual questions of what would it be if they were here. I mean, there are, as I say, there are live people doing this stuff today, and there are a lot of utilitarians that do want to argue we should care about the environment. It's hard because even if a tree is conscious, a tree doesn't have a central nervous system, and that's what utilitarianism really cares about. Pleasure, pain. Suppose you could push it to flourishing, like we were trying to define happiness there, so you might be able to include it. It's harder. It's harder. For Kant, it's almost impossible. So since these are the languages that we have to talk about ethics today, it's really hard to have a good conversation about environmentalism. We're struggling. I guess that's the only thing I'm trying to say, because this isn't our inheritance. This is what we're getting from the Enlightenment. So maybe one more question, then we'll go to something else. Yes?
I just wanted to agree kind of in a way, and I was going to stress at the point that their answers and their philosophies are based in a society that has base assumptions already formed that they're running with and they're not questioning. Like, we're separate from the environment. If we were the same thing as the environment, then it would be in our best interest to make the trees happy.
I like that a lot. And the only thing, I was just trying to be devil's advocate for these folks here.
Right.
I mean, the only thing like Kant would say, for instance, is, would you say that to me if I had just given you a lecture about math? Would you say, well, sure, coming from your environment, that's what you would have thought at that time. He's saying, I'm just defining logic, right? And what is logically contradictory has always been logically contradictory. And I'm just basing my ethics on that. So whether these guys, and unfortunately there's all guys pretty much in the Enlightenment, whether these guys succeed or fail, I guess the important takeaway is they're trying to find a basis for this that's universal, that'll get us over our differences so we can actually have a discussion about what's moral. That sounds fantastic, and it sounds like a good prescription for solving the environmental crisis that we've got. Yet when we actually try to use these theories, they don't give us a lot of good tools to talk about that stuff. It's difficult. All right, so since our time is limited, let me give you these other sort of philosophical ins to the sorts of things that we're talking about. We've got this messed up world. It's a hard thing to deal with. And the next topic that I wanted to talk to us about is that the problems that we have with pollution, with an environment that seems to constantly be in danger, might be able to be solved by talking a little bit about the problem of gradual change. So, pardon me. And there's absolutely nobody in here. You are the choir, I'm the preacher right now, so it makes no sense for me to talk to you about global warming. But you and I both know that there are a ton of people out there trying to argue it's not even real. And it's a bizarre thing, and I have the same sorts of problems that I imagine some people in this room do. When you hear people arguing that way, you just think, how could you think that way? How could a rational, smart person think that way? But I guess one thing I'll suggest here is that it's politically driven, for sure, a lot of that is politically driven. But there is a more subtle ontological sort of problem that we might want to take into consideration. We human beings, we rational creatures, have a very difficult time thinking about what something is when that thing is changing slowly in front of our eyes. And it just seems to be a basic problem of rationality that we can't deal with that super well. It's always been there. It's been there from the very beginning of Western civilization, for sure. And I wanted to give you a quick example of that. So can I give you the example and then we'll get to the questions?
Real quick, can you
Yeah,
define ontological?
Oh yeah, of course. So I'll talk about that some more. Ontology means it's a metaphysical term. So we're talking about the being of something, what something is.
Okay.
So if I said we're going to talk about the ontological status of numbers, I mean we're going to say what is a number? What is 2? Like, is 2 something? Or is 2 just something we made up because we saw 2 things and we made up this concept? Or is there 2-ness somewhere? And if it exists, where does it exist? Right? So the ontology of numbers would be about that. We're going to talk about the ontology of things that are changing. So I thought what I'd do is I'd give you a really fast example that comes to us 2.5 millennia old. This is something that Socrates talked about with his pupils, and it's a story involving a fellow named Theseus and his ship. So the story is going to be familiar to you, I bet. Theseus has gone off to war, and it's a long war, far away from Greece, his homeland. The war is over, they won, and everybody's headed back, but Theseus ends up not getting back so quickly. It takes him years to get back because he gets stranded on islands and he meets all sorts of characters. You've heard this story before, right? And it takes him a long time to get back to Greece. Meanwhile, after all this time has passed, everybody in Greece thinks that he must be dead. He must be lost at sea and they'll never see him again. So in the shipyards at Greece, they decide, we might as well just give up on Theseus. It's been several years. He's not going to make it home. We should rebuild his ship to replenish the navy. And so that's what they do. They decide they're going to build a ship, the exact make and model of Theseus' ship, just like the one that was lost, And they build it, brand spanking new, never been out at sea, and they park it here in what I've labeled Dock B. And wouldn't you know it, the exact same day they finished that ship, wandering back after years and years of being at sea, here comes Theseus in his beat up, rugged, waterlogged, ripped apart ship, barely making it into port, and he pulls it into dock bay. Everybody's super happy to have him there. They have a big celebration. Theseus is back. Most of his crew is made at home. They all go into town and they celebrate like only the Greeks can celebrate, which means they drink themselves blind day after day after day. A huge party, wonderful party. The first night, one of Theseus' crew wanders back to the docks drunk. And he sees the new ship in Dock B and his old, which I've just made kind of blurry to be old, ship in Dock A. And he says, they lost faith in us. They didn't think we'd be back. How could they do that to us? He looks around, no one's looking. And he sneaks onto the ship in Dock B. And he rips up one of the planks. He runs over to Dock A. He finds the exact same plank in his beat up ship, puts the nice one down there, nails it down, and then goes back over to Dock B and puts the old rotten, splintery plank there, and then wanders back into town and continues the party. Night after night he does this, wandering back in a drunken stupor to the docks, moving plank by plank. When he's finished with the planks, he starts on the other parts, a piece of rope, a mast, a sail, until after, let's say, 3 months, he has moved every single piece of that ship into the other ship. Theseus himself shows up at 3 months. Where's his ship now? Well, we know it was in Dock A, that's where he pulled in. Is it still there? I'm going to leave this one a rhetorical one for you. What makes something the thing that it is? And that's the philosophical question. And that's what worried the Greeks. And they didn't want to leave this up in the air. They didn't want to say, well, it's just what anybody says, because the stakes are high. What makes a thing the thing that it is? Because it looks like there's no good answer to this. If you want to say, Theseus' ship is now in Dock B, when did it start being in Dock B? Just at the last moment when the last tiny little nail was transferred over? That's super weird, right? Theseus' ship here, Theseus' ship here, I move a nail, bam! It jumps over here. Now this is Theseus' ship. Did it happen halfway through? Do you mean halfway through the number of nights, halfway through the number of pieces, halfway through the weight of all the pieces? It's all completely arbitrary. And if you want to say his ship is still in Dock A, that's Theseus' ship now, that's super weird too, because it's a brand new shiny ship that's never been at sea. How you answer this question says a lot about what you think a thing is. And everything is changing all the time around us. That's when the stakes get really high. Because if you say, well, as soon as any change took place, it stopped being in the original place. Well, things are changing constantly. The moment the ship goes out to sea, some water rubs against it, a little molecule of wood comes up. It's not his ship anymore? That's ridiculous. And it gets super weird when you think about it in terms of you. Because you are made up of pieces too. You are made up of atoms. And atoms are constantly moving in and out of you. Hundreds of millions of them just left me right now. Hundreds of millions. And I'll replace them by breathing things in, drinking water, eating food. Somebody actually did these calculations. And they found that it takes on average about 4 to 5 years for an adult human to have all of the atoms switched out of their body with new atoms. You are literally Theseus' ship. You are being replaced plank by plank, and the only reason you're not worried about it is that I'm not collecting all of your atoms and putting them all together to make another you someplace. But theoretically I could. So are you you?
So what's the answer?
What's the answer? Then I'll be the philosopher. What is the answer? That's the thing to think about, right? So, good answer. When did it stop being his ship? At the very first moment he started to rip it out, it just stopped being a thing. So, Peter, I'm no longer Peter. I know, it feels like a good answer, but it ends up in a weird place.
Well, wouldn't the worm in that case still be his ship? I mean, if there was no second ship, if somebody was just bringing in and updating his ship with current planks and then just throwing out the old ones and like burning them, destroying them completely, in the end, we wouldn't have this argument. It would
That's
be,
right.
It's his ship, it just was updated.
You got it. But should we be having the argument, even if we wouldn't be? Because are we being blinded by the fact that the pieces are all dispersed, so it never occurs to us to ask, is this still his ship? And this is a thought experiment that brings to mind, wait a minute, we should ask that. In the early days of aviation in the United States, there was a big prize, $10,000, for the first person who could fly a plane from New York to California. And lots of people were trying to do this. You were allowed to make landings along the way. It didn't have to be continuous, but you had to fly the same plane from New York to California. And one team did it. And these are the very early days of aviation. They would take off, and after a couple of miles, they would crash. And they had a car following behind them, and it had spare parts, and they were constantly fixing the thing up. And when they got to California, they were denied the $10,000 because they claimed that's not the same plane.
We argue that these ontological questions are silly, and that categories and beingness are just things that are useful to people, and that there's no essential, this is a ship, there's no essential me in terms of my physical boundaries and what matter is part of me, what matter isn't part of me. Those are just useful things that humans use to talk about stuff.
Sure.
They don't exist.
So, it's a possibility. You could argue that, and there have been a lot of people that have argued that. One way of arguing that is called nominalism, where you say it's all just a question of language. Our language is making up concepts, and the concepts then do a lot of work for us. Maybe there is no anything. Maybe there is no you. It's an interesting question considering these things, because we do tend to use these concepts and think we're describing something. I think that you probably think that the water bottle, the computer that's in front of you is yours, and it's the same one that was there before the break. And you probably even think that you are the same person you were when you were in grade school. I mean, I know psychologically you should, but you know what I mean, right? And if that's just fake, then the world as we know it is not what the world really is. And the reason I bring this up is because it's a question of gradual change over time. If we just pulled one ship out and moved it over and put the other ship dead, no one's got a problem. The problem is we were doing little tiny things to make little tiny differences. And my suggestion then is that that's partly what's going on with global warming. And that's partly why a lot of people have a problem with it. It is global warming. But you don't see it all there. You just see little tiny changes, and the world looks similar to how it did the other day, and so it's hard to see. Incremental changes over time raise these difficult ontological questions. Sometimes there's evidence that it's the case, but not always. Right? It's not always. Third point. Tools. This is a deep philosophic point, and it has a lot to do, especially for engineers, a lot of importance for engineers. When we think about the different tools that we're going to be using to try to solve the crisis that we're in, the assumption usually is there's a problem, I just need to find the right tool to solve that problem and then use that tool correctly and get other people to use it. And we think that the tool itself is just a means toward solving that problem, a means toward doing something else. But my suggestion is that tools have values built into them that you and I cannot overcome. And until we realize that, we may not do a very good job solving the crisis that we're in right now. Let me give you an example of that. This is a classic example that gets us away from sustainability for a minute, but I think it's a pretty clear one. A hammer. Most of us would think of a hammer as a tool that is in itself value neutral. If I were to ask you, is a hammer good? You would think that's a weird question. You would say, well, you can use it for good or you can use it for bad. Right? You can use it to build homes for the homeless, or you can use it to bonk people on the head, and it's all in how you use it, but the hammer is just a hammer. Until a person picks it up, it's just a hammer. And we can use it in all sorts of different ways, the standard way that it's used, or you can use it for bad, to do bad things. But if you think about it, if you stop and look at a hammer has values built into it. They're not up to you, and it's not a question of how you use it. The hammer demands that you use it a particular way, and in so doing, you adopt the values that the hammer wants you to adopt. You must pick up a hammer with your hand. You can't grab it between your knees and start swinging. It demands that you grab it with your hand. That seems like a stupid thing, right? But it's important. It's the first important thing. A hammer demands that you set certain goals for yourself, like developing eye-hand coordination. That's important to be able to use a hammer. A hammer tells you that's important. Make sure you've got this ability. It doesn't care about other abilities. A hammer says, how are you going to power me? You're going to power me with muscle. It doesn't care about petroleum. It says build muscle. A hammer gives you a certain rhythm to your body. It demands that you work the way it wants you to work. You can't hammer. Have you ever tried to hammer like that? You won't get the nail in. It demands that your body comport to it. You adopt the rhythm that the hammer wants you to adopt. You hammer something at the pace that the hammer wants you to hammer. When you pick up the hammer, you become a hammer user. You end up saying all of those values that I just talked about. Eye-hand coordination, muscle power over biodiesel. These are important values. These are good values because as a hammer user, you must adopt them to use the hammer. Even more importantly, the moment you pick up a hammer, your entire worldview changes. You've got a hammer in your hand now. Now you start thinking about things that are hittable and things that are not hittable. Everything's categorized that way. Because to a man with a hammer in his hand, everything starts looking like a potential nail. And now you've got to ask yourself, should I hit it or shouldn't I hit it? So, tools, not just hammers, but all tools and all technology have values built into them. There's never been a value-neutral tool. As soon as you pick it up, as soon as you adopt it and use it, you've bought into the values. We can try to push them, but the values are going to be there. This is an example of communications technologies. In the 1960s and 70s, it became popular in this country to start talking about the medium is the message. And that's very similar to what I'm suggesting here, that the tool itself is more important sometimes than the thing you're using the tool for because it tells you what to do. Smoke signals are great for communicating certain things. A telegraph is great for communicating certain things, but it's difficult to do poetry with smoke signals, to create a simile or a metaphor. And could you really have a political debate on a telegraph? You might try to type out a transcript, but would it really be a debate? The tool itself dictates that's not possible. It's not a question of using it better. Well, if I were just better at smoke signals, I could do a really great poem. No. The tool itself says that's not possible. There are certain structures that are just not built into that tool that won't let you do that. These are a couple examples from Monty Python. This is Wuthering Heights and Semaphore, where they just wave flags at each other and don't speak. Perform an entire novel. Julius Caesar with flashing lanterns instead of speaking. It's weird. It doesn't seem like those are the actual works of art when you use those tools to do the communication. So, here's an example that we can talk about that might get us thinking about sustainability as well. The example of the telephone. The telephone was introduced in the late 19th century, and pretty clearly it looked like it was going to start taking over. People were going to start using it all the time. And it's fascinating that in that time, right around the turn of the century, in fact, as it becoming very popular, a group of scholars got together in New York City. And they were composed of scientists, philosophers, cultural critics, religious people as well, all sorts of different people. And they were asked to think about, how do you think society will change if this telephone really takes off? And we still have those records of their predictions that they made about the telephone. There's this tiny little type I know for you, but I wanted to put some of these up here because they're startlingly accurate. Telephones will be used for advertising as well as shopping. It's going to get rid of regional dialects. They'll be used for military command. They'll encourage distant and centralized authority. There's one here, the third one, about skyscrapers. Telephones led to skyscrapers because it was hard to send runners up and down the stairs constantly, all day long, with information from one department to another. With the telephone, it's easy, so let's build them higher. The quality of letter writing will decline. There was an article in, I think it was the Times, just a week or two ago, that this generation right now has the worst handwriting of any generation in the United States. Because nobody writes anything anymore. Everything is texted or typed into a computer, so no one's practicing handwriting at all. The telephone will lower emphasis on writing schools. It will have an insistent, demanding quality. Think of how we've just bought into it. Hardly anybody uses a landline anymore. I'm one of the very few people, I think, in the world that still doesn't have a cell phone. Just trying to hold out, don't want to do it. But phones are weird. They demand that you always be available. They always want you to be checking them. It's like your Facebook page. It's just, look at me, look at me, look at me. And when that cell phone buzzes or vibrates or rings, you'll stop whatever you're doing to do that, to attend to it. Our mentality has radically changed. Imagine if you had a friend, you're having a conversation with somebody, a friend, and someone comes up to you in the middle of the conversation and says, hey, 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 hey. Would you be inclined to say, let me talk to this person for a minute. Sounds like that might be good. And yet we'll do that for a phone and a heartbeat. The fascinating thing is that long before everybody had a telephone, we got together smart people and they said, how will the tool itself create certain values in society? And they got a lot of it right. If we were to think about this in terms of other things, like an electric car. An electric car is not just a regular car, but it happens to be electric. It's a brand new thing. It has its own values built into it. Just like a cell phone is not just like a regular phone, only it's mobile. It's a completely different thing. It has a different set of values built into it. Before we make the tool, let's talk about the values that are going to be in the tool and whether they're the values that are going to lead to a good society. Will they lead to flourishing? Will they lead to social justice? Will they lead to a better environment? And the easiest thing in the world is to think, that's not my department. I'm the engineer. I'm the public policy person. But then it's nobody's department. That's a classic Werner von Braun response, right? Once the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. Yes?
How do you differentiate between like the sort of ontological analysis of the thing, like you were mentioning about the hammer, it's like the hammer and the handle is meant to be held a certain way, it's meant to be used with an arm. How do you differentiate that from all of the sort of ethical value considerations of like, is this a sustainably manufactured hammer? Because that sort of seems to open up many other cans of worms, and I think a lot of times, especially in the question of sustainability, people are like, oh, well, it's green because it's made out of, you know, a recycled, you know, thing, but maybe
fantastic
it's made
question.
unethically. So how does that?
If you really put your mind to it, humans are smart, right? If we really put our mind to it, you can make a super, super green assault rifle. Right? Sustainably harvest wood for the gun stock.
The 3D printer of recycled plastic.
For sure, right? If we put our minds to it, that could be the question. So what I'm suggesting here is that we've got those questions to answer. But there's also this other question we might not have considered. Not just how is this tool being made, is it manufactured in a good, environmentally sustainable way, but let's talk about this tool to begin with. What are the values that are inherent to the tool itself? So if we're talking about energy, for instance, we think, how are we going to support our society? Are we going to end up being nuclear? Are we going to go solar? Let's crunch the numbers. Well, it's not that simple. Because the tool that we use to do it is going to impose certain values on the society because of the tool. It's not just about, we don't have enough energy, how do we get to have enough energy? Well, here's the way and here's the numbers to do that. Different paths exist to do that, and those different tools will mean different things. So just very, very briefly, for instance, a nuclear power plant, even if we put aside the question of what we're going to do with the waste and is it dangerous and stuff, a nuclear power plant, for instance, requires centralized authority and massive infrastructure. You need to have either a government or a corporation running that thing. Bob next door can't have a nuclear power plant. It's got to be somebody centralized, which means that that tool itself, if we choose that tool, means we are choosing centralized power. Not just power to power our society, but political power. And then a grid that's going to have to be controlled by somebody who's not us to deliver it. Whereas if you think about a solar panel, potentially, you can have your own solar panel in your own house, and it doesn't have to be centralized. Now, I'm not necessarily saying even one's good or one's bad right now. All I'm saying is that we need to think about this ontological question. What is the value built into the tool? And not just try to look at the ultimate goal of how do I power society. It's how are you going about doing that powering? Because when you make the decision, let's go this route, there are things built into that tool and that technology that will necessarily create values in that society. And we're smart. We can think this through before we do it, and not just have it thrust on us. Conceptualizing energy. As we think about how to energize ourselves, we need to think about what we think of energy in general. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, there were people already saying that maybe our conception of energy itself is somehow bad. William Blake's an example of that. He thought England was a sick rose. And there was a virus, a worm, bad stuff eating through it. And it wasn't pollution. It was the desire for more energy. And the desire to take it from wherever we could get it. This was a major change in the way we conceptualized energy in the Industrial Revolution. And we've not thought about this. It's even evident in the art of the time, because art both creates culture and reflects it. It's got that great bootstrappy circular thing. There's a lot of good stuff to it. This is a painting by Turner. And if you look at the paintings that are going on right before the Industrial Revolution, if there are paintings of boats, you see a boat going along with the wind, floating on a river or the ocean. After the Industrial Revolution, you have Turner. You have a steam-powered ship that is fighting against the current, fighting against the wind, fighting against the ocean. We're going to take that energy and we're going to use it to go against nature. Concretely, here's a good example. Energy, sustainability, and how we eat. As we moved from draft animal farming to industrialized farming, it wasn't just that we adopted a different tool, but everything else stayed the same. The tool changes everything. And in this instance, it changes our conceptualization of energy. We've always needed energy to get food. But when you had draft animals doing your farming, they had to be cared for, nurtured, cajoled sometimes to give you what you wanted. They demanded something back from you, responsibility. And in fact, on most family farms, it was almost like a member of the family, the worker animals that you had. When we moved to the steam engine, the steam-powered tractor, it's not just a different tool, it's a different mindset. We now think energy is something that's there for me, I have a right to it, I deserve it whenever I want, I can take and I don't have to give anything back, and everything changes. An example of how everything changes, even our conception of what is efficient changes because our conception of energy has changed. I pulled up some numbers for you about sustainable agriculture and how we power things. Calories in and calories out in nomadic herding societies, you put 1 calorie of work in and you get 9.7 calories of food out to sustain you. It's a really great way of life. Even better actually is draft animal farming. It's one of the best. If you have a farm, especially where the leftover crops that you don't eat are the sorts of crops that your draft animals eat, they eat the stalks of the hay, etc. You have a nice sort of cycle going. You put very little work in and you get a ton of food out. That's not how we run things today. Industrial beef is currently at 1 calorie in and you get 0.2 out. It's an 80% loss in terms of the food that we're feeding ourselves. Industrial pork is a little bit better, but still running at a loss. If you put together all animals and all crops in the United States, it takes 1 calorie to make 0.1 calories of food. That means you got to put almost 10 calories of work in to get 1 calorie of food out in the United States. And the weird thing is, we think that industrial agriculture is efficient. It's actually the opposite of efficient. But what it means is that we've even altered our conception of what efficiency is. And it's telling that it's been altered in a way that ends up supporting big business, corporations, and the mega machine of capitalism. When you adopt a new tool, you adopt a new viewpoint on the world, you conceptualize energy in a new way, and you even think about terms like efficiency in a new way. And I guess part of the worry here is, and what I would suggest maybe we can think about together, is that even if we say, well, maybe solar is going to be our solution. Let's say that for a moment. Are we still conceptualizing energy in this, it's always there for me and I deserve as much of it as I can get out without putting anything back in idea? Whether it's we're drilling it out of the earth with petroleum, or whether it's the sun up there and I say it's boundless, I can take as much as I want. We're still conceptualizing energy in a way that it's there and it's mine, and I should be able to get as much as I possibly can and do whatever it is that I want with it. The philosophical suggestion here is, maybe that mentality was constitutive of the problem that we have now to begin with. Maybe it eventually led to this crisis that we have. And so, thinking the same way about the solution may not get us in a good place. A lot more to say there, but finally the last question that I'll raise is just a general question about sustainability, and this is maybe the most controversial suggestion that I have to make, because we all love sustainability, but I guess as a good philosopher and someone who might be asked to drink the hemlock, the question I would raise is, are you sure that's what you want? Is it really sustainability that we should be asking for? Back when I was younger, in school, like in the 1980s, we talked about politics in terms of first world and third world. There was that weird second world category where we stuck all the communist evil people, right? But it was first world and third world. And maybe in the 90s, sort of into the 2000s, people were not talking that way anymore. It was not only politically incorrect, but it was sort of, well, those are loaded terms. First looks like you won, right? Of course we won, so we're first world. And we changed it. And so by the time I was in graduate school, everybody was talking about development theory. There's the developed world, the underdeveloped world, and you're a developing country, not a third world country. The thing is, that's just as packed. Developing? Developing toward what? Developing toward us because we're the model, everybody wants to be us and everybody should be us? Underdeveloped? That's a huge value judgment built into it. And when we start thinking about sustainability, we tend to use those same sort of categories. Developed nations, developing nations. There were so many political cartoons that I could find that talked about this. And we all worry, what's going to happen when the rest of the undeveloped world, the developing world, wants to be like us? If you give every Chinese person a car, what's going to happen to the world? We think of it that way. How can we sustain it? And I guess the question might be, well, we have all these values built into that way of thinking. Not just language, about concepts. There are trajectories that we're assuming are necessary. So if we're talking about sustainability, what does it mean to say that that's our goal? And this is a big question to leave us with, especially when we don't have time to talk about it. but it's something that I would suggest maybe you let percolate in the back of your mind. Why do we want to sustain the world that we have right now? Is this way of life sustainable? Not just in terms of can it be sustained, but should it be sustained? Should we find a way to give everybody power like we have now, just a different kind of power that's not messing up the environment so much? If sustainability is the goal, it's assuming that the way that you and I are living in the first world, the developed world, is the way everybody should be living. Let's find a way to do that. And again, the philosopher says, don't stack the deck before we even begin looking for the solutions. Let's ask ourselves, why are we pursuing sustainability to begin with? Maybe that's what we want to do, but why are we pursuing it? Maybe the way we're living is not good. And so instead of looking for a way to sustain it, we should be looking for a way to radically change it. And this is a horrible, horrible metaphor, and I hope you'll forgive me for using it. But if you come across somebody being raped, I would hope that you wouldn't say, this is terrible. Let me find a way to make this more sustainable for the person being raped. Let me put a pillow under her head or something to make this a little more comfortable. How can I sustain this? Just assuming that what we want to do is to find a way to continue with the status quo, only cleaner, greener. Maybe stacking the deck such that it's going to lead to the same crisis down the road no matter what. So to be a good philosopher, on top of all the other good things that you are, is to ask these big questions. To ask the underlying questions that the Delphic Oracle, which is the symbol for SISE, the Delphic Oracle, who said, know thyself. She was also the one that said Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates said, well, I guess that's true if by that you mean I'm the only one who knows that he's stupid. I'm the only one who's really questioning things and doesn't think he knows all the answers. To know yourself means to provide a space for yourself to ask these questions before we do the tools, before you do the research. Don't leave it to somebody else. Don't say that's not my department. It's a lot to ask, I know. But one of the great things about being so different is maybe we can all come at it from our different angles and we can do it together in a sustainable way. I think that's about it for today. All right.